Hello, hello, hello. Hope y'all can hear me and everyone's well out there. I did have to play with the audio settings earlier this week, so I don't know if everything's coming through the same, but hopefully it's okay. Welcome one and all to Philosophy Roulette. I believe we are number 252. It's amazing. That's a lot of numbers. 2 and 5 and then 2 again. It's huge. So what I do is I read and review philosophy papers live on air for the Twitch audience, and then later on the YouTubes when I get around to uploading them, which I have to do before they disappear. Forgot I need to do that. Anywho's, I don't have any suggestions for today, but I figured I'd stream, so let's just go see what's on the top of the heap. Because it is just a heap. Not a pile, but a heap. Ooh, analysis. I love you, analysis. You're so short. David Chalmers, Interpretivism and Inferentialism. I mean, it's like, come on, Chalmers. Let's see if you, David Chalmers has put his paper on. Let's see. It's like, this is almost like a Insta download, because he made his name, I think, with an analysis paper. So it's 13 pages, so it's a little bit long for a analysis thing, but like, it just, you kind of have to. So we'll see. Yeah, all of 1, 2, 3, 4 references. Isn't that exciting? 4 references on a David Chalmers paper about interpretivism and inferentialism. Let's see what else is available from. So we'll keep this one open, and let's see what else. A new solution to the regress of pure powers. Ooh, is act consequentialism self-effacing? So we can take a look at all 3 of these real quick, but it's not available, so we're not going to take a look at it. Oh well. For a new response to the regress argument against pure powers ontologies. This involves rejecting an overlooked premise, which is that a power's manifestation is exhaustively accounted for by the powers involved in it. Rejection of this premise is not only answers the regress argument, but also brings with it wider metaphysical consequences, including a shift away from one category ontologies. Ooh. You know, I kind of like powers arguments just because they're a little bit, you know, you just don't hear about powers as much nowadays. I don't know. So, pure powers ontologies, but can't read it because it's not available. Let's see if Henry Taylor has uploaded it. I doubt it though, but you never know. Yeah, research portal. Not published. It's gonna be like embargoed. Yeah, embargo ends 10/25/21, so you have to wait till like next month. Okay, that's not even that bad, but like 25/10/21 is actually no. Is this 2025? I don't know if this, or is it the 25th of October 2021? This is funny. I don't actually know is it a 4-year embargo or 1 month embargo on this website? Whatever. Can't read it either way. And is act consequentialism self-effacing from Nikhil Venkatesh. Excuse me. Ooh, but it's available, so you could always read this. Send us semiotics. They just made me watch a commercial to join the chat for a car, really? Yeah, I'm sorry. I have no control over Twitch. I apologize for this state of capitalism at the moment that I am participating in. But how are you, other than having to be forced to watch a car ad to see me talk about philosophy? Hope you're doing well. Yeah, so we've got a Chalmers paper on interpretivism and inferentialism. And we've also got this, is act consequentialism self-effacing? It doesn't say you're subscribed at the moment. So if you subscribe, you should be able to stop that. That is like the main benefit of subscribing. But I think your last subscription ran out last month, as it were. So I do think you can, but I think your subscription ran out. It's been that long, and I thank you for your subscriptions when you do subscribe. But it's been a while. I've been the pandemic has been going on a long time. So, let's see. In this paper, I will show that one argument suggested by Parfit and Railton fails to establish that the thing is self-effacing for individual. However, a slightly different argument may show that C is self-effacing for groups. This raises the intriguing possibility that it might be right for an individual but not for a group of which they are a member to accept a moral theory. This possibility, odd though it seems, might be helpful to consequentialists. That's interesting. I kind of feel like we have to do the Chalmers just because Chalmers is a big name. Thank you, Cinesemiotics. I appreciate it. And hopefully this will kill the ads for you. If it doesn't, then we have a beef with Twitch, but it should kill it. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that can be done. Like, there literally isn't. And the worst part about it is, I've heard other streamers talk about this, that once you even get bigger, they want more ads. They don't want less ads. Even though you're pulling in more money for them, they want to be able to run even more ads. And so it's harder. And so you have to make like a special deal with Twitch if you don't want ads on your stream. And that's why you get like these terrible, like seven ads in a row, like, for on some streams, because Twitch really wants to sell ads. Thank you through March. Did you do a full year? No, that's like 6 months. Wow. See, I can't add, but thank you. All right, so no. Alright, and here's the link. So, and you can always grab the paper if you're here live by typing !paper. It brings the link back up for those who are wondering what I'm reading when I'm reading stuff. Let's see. With the bookkeeping done, we're gonna work. Let's see. Not gonna work the first time. Cinesemiac says, you don't want to ever have that experience again, holding you hostage to capitalism before letting me express my outrage about commercialism or something. That sounds about right. But what are you gonna do at this point? Nope, not this one. This one. Yeah. Everything, even when you don't update, somehow it still updates, and it makes everything difficult. Yeah, the level of capitalism right now, the surveillance capitalism, basically, where they want to know who you are, so they surveil you to sell you stuff. It's just kind of maddening. And so that's what it is. They hold you hostage to these, like, things where they force you to look at stuff, and then they force you to give up information about yourself. It's like the current way that this world is, the economy runs. It's terrible. And like there's got to be other ways, but it was I will philosophize hard. I have a paper coming out, so when that gets a little farther along the line and I realize it's actually coming out, I'm not counting my eggs before it hatches, so I've got like my work I can read on stream. I've got plenty of other stuff that's I'd like to do. Maybe some Clockwork Orange. There's like, I want to like mix things up a little, like, maybe have a series on like a philosophy topic. So like if you want to talk about semiotics, well, maybe we'll have like a semiotics week or something, or like semiotics 2 weeks. If you want to talk about something else, maybe I'll go do that. Cause like, people like the ethics talks sometimes are, I think a little bit more accessible than the, navel-gazing metaphysics, even though navel-gazing metaphysics is a lot of fun for philosophers. Like, it doesn't always make the best stream. So there's stuff that can be done, and so I've got some things in the works. I haven't been able to think recently because everything's been a little crazy around here. But yeah, we're full steam ahead, or not even full steam, maybe like 3/4 steam ahead. So we got stuff to be done, a lot of stuff to be done, and the state of academia and like capitalism and the United States at the moment and all sorts of stuff is just, it is not the best situation. So, yeah, papers are like secrets. They do need work, and like you have to work at them. Some philosophers describe it as like being a miner. You really have to dig a long time before you get anywhere. And it's true. It's like a lot of kind of like repetitive hard work, and then you sometimes get somewhere. But yeah, so streaming is good because it allows me to not just write stuff for like whoever, the few people that might read it if it never even gets published, but like streaming at least, this is published work. Other people get to read stuff that like people are working on. They believe in it. That doesn't make it good, but people believe in it, so it's like whatever. So I like streaming. You get a chance to talk about stuff with people and like ideas. So yeah, that's cool. And as always, for all the other people watching, you are free to ask questions. Please do. This is my first time reading it. We don't know exactly what is going to happen. Chalmers is a semi-famous person in philosophy, so you hope that Chalmers has something interesting to say. I've met Chalmers a few times on a few occasions in New York. He seems nice enough. Like, he really does. Do I ever worry that my work will go unseen? I don't have to worry about that. It's usually the case that the work goes unseen. That's how most philosophy is. Most philosophy is unreferenced or very few references. Yeah, it's not really a worry. It's basically the state of academia. There's more research produced than any person can read. So the idea that it's going to go unseen is basically a given. You kind of hope that some people will be interested and you hit a few people, and that's all you can really hope for at the moment. That's part of one of the reasons. You just fucking yes, I did. So, well, I'm in New York. There are philosophers in New York. He works in New York. I am in New York. Like, this is not impossible to do. Like, if you go around to like philosophy talks in New York, which I used to do before all the things stopped. I don't know the guy. I said I met him a few times. I didn't say I know the guy. I said I met him a few times. So you would run into philosophers in the city. If I know the guy, I'll tell you. I do know some people. Chalmers I've met on a few occasions. I wouldn't say I know him. Yes, that is right. We all know each other. Like all my cousins and stuff. That said, let's see what Chalmers has to say. Robbie Williams' book, The Metaphysics of Representation, is the new leading edge of the program of naturalizing intentionality. Oh, intentionality, aboutness. Williams brings sophisticated ideas from many areas of philosophy to bear on this key problem in the philosophy of mind. Many philosophers will characterize their own views by how they relate to Williams' view. I do the same here. Williams' view is a form of interpretism in the mold of Ramsey, Davidson, Lewis, and others. The basic idea of these approaches is that a subject is assigned the contentful mental states that best rationalize their subject's actions, given certain constraints and certain principles of rationality. I think I just read something. What was it? About this, because this was the best rationalized. I think this was the paper from just like a week or two ago, where they were talking about the mental states that best rationalize the subject's actions. So I think I just read a paper referencing this book, actually. So, the most familiar version of interpretivism, I can't speak today, interpretivism appeals to means ends rationality as its central principle. Roughly, people have those beliefs and desires such that, if their beliefs are correct, their actions are likely to satisfy their desires. Okay, so basically, You have some whatever you're doing, you're trying to best rationalize it, and if you have beliefs and desires, and if they're correct, then your actions satisfy your desires. Seems like a reasonable setup. This version of interpretivism comes up against a huge problem: underdetermination. Given one successful interpretation that maximizes means-ends rationality, it is easy to permute the content of beliefs and desires to come up with any number of alternative interpretations that serve means-ends rationality as well. To avoid this underdetermination problem, many have suggested adding further constraints. Principles of charity, for example, or constraining contents to involve natural properties or properties that play certain causal roles. Still, underdetermination problems have often persisted even when these constraints are added, and no theory of this sort has met with any sort of wide acceptance. That's basically what's going on here. When you say, if you're trying to figure out what the best rationalization for like someone's actions are, there's going to be more than one way to figure out what a best rationalization is. It's like best according to what are you doing, according to who. And so if you're trying to figure out, like, interpret something and you're trying to figure out how to do it, there's no obvious way to do, like, that. There's only one best answer when it comes to people. And so basically it's underdetermined how to actually figure out what people are up to, because there's always more than one way you can interpret stuff, and then according to who is, like, one outcome the best, or one reason the best. So this is an old problem, like how do you know what people are up to? In part to avoid these problems, Williams adds not one, but three innovations to traditional interpretivism. First, he adds source intentionality. Williams' interpretivism presupposes a first tier of mental states in perception and actions whose content is not grounded in interpretivism, but instead through Karen Neander's teleosemantic analysis. Second, he appeals not just to structural rationality, means-ends rationality, coherence, and the like, but also substantive rationality, including the rationality of induction, abduction, morality, and more. Third, he appeals to language of thought, at least as a contingent feature of human thinkers, assigning contents initially not to total states of people, but to world-like elements of structured mental states. Each of these innovations is powerful and makes it much easier for interpretivism to meet various challenges. My worry is that the innovations are, if anything, too powerful, and that they may involve an element of overkill. First, I think that if one appeals to source intentionality, one need not also appeal to substantive rationality to solve permutation problems. Second, I think that if one appeals to language of thought, as Williams does, one moves or should move beyond interpretivism to a sort of inferentialism about grounds of mental content. As a result, I think Williams' powerful framework can be seen as supporting a sort of inferentialist metasemantics with source intentionality, or what I've elsewhere called a two-tiered inferentialism. What's one thing that's kind of interesting about just like having read two papers on the same topic in like a week or two is like, even in philosophy there's trends, and so this is sort of like, this is trending. This is a fad in philosophy, I guess, this Williams inferentialism or interpretivism. So, Cottage Industry, write a few papers on the trending book, and then you move on to the next thing. But like, doesn't make it good or bad. It just means this is sort of how the sociology of philosophy works. I was talking about this with some people just a few days ago. So the idea is basically that, everyone's talking about this intentionality interpretivism right now. Thank you for the bits, Semiotics. That's appreciate it. You get the cute little doggy, which is nice. That's a cute dog. Yeah, I also want to upgrade my stream so that I can have the on-screen alerts, but on-screen alerts. I'll do that. There is a way to do it, and it kind of works, but I basically need a new computer. Okay. So, source intentionality and substantive rationality. These are big words. It's driving me nuts. It's a familiar idea that taking some intentionality for granted can help to remove interpretivism's permutation problem. In Ramsey's pioneering form of interpretivism, he essentially took certain preferences for granted in choosing between possible outcomes. With preferences in hand, he was able to define relative utilities and credences, which are quantitative versions of beliefs and desires. Others have suggested taking the content of certain special words or representations, such as natural or cause, for granted, reducing or eliminating permutation problems that way. Williams appeals to a distinctive sort of source intentionality, the intentionality of perception and action. You might think this would be more than enough to remove permutation problems. Surprisingly, Williams thinks his source intentionality is not enough to remove the problems. The reasons are tied to a permutation problem that Williams calls the bubble puzzle. The basic idea is that the contents of perception and action are always concerned what is going on within a limited bubble, so that one can always permute contents outside the bubble, yielding an unacceptable level of indeterminacy. As a result, Williams holds that in addition to source intentionality and structural rationality, one also needs to appeal to substantive rationality to remove permutation problems. What the heck does this mean? The bubble puzzle? So there's contents of perceptions. We're living in our little perception bubble. And so that's what you can do, but anything outside of perception, then you just have to sort of permute. There's stuff going on. I mean, maybe that's what this bubble puzzle is. I don't understand. But I mean, you can always say, like, we only have like a little bubble of perception. So I don't know. This raises obvious questions. We all know that appealing to enough source intentionality can remove permutation problems. I don't know this, but that's because I'm an idiot and I don't know what you guys are talking about, but it's an interesting claim that is made right here. Why appeal to source intentionality only to leave permutation problems intact? Why not instead appeal to a slightly thicker version of source intentionality that removes these problems? Well, that's fair. Why don't you just solve the problem instead of using a half measure? One simple way to go would be to appeal to source intentionality for certain basic concepts corresponding to certain words in the language of thought. For example, it would be enough to appeal to source intentionality for spatial concepts, including concepts of spatial magnitudes, such as being so many meters apart. Suppose one's perceptual bubble extends 100 meters from oneself. Then one can straightforwardly formulate thoughts such as, there are objects 200 meters away. Perhaps using different numerical magnitudes in thought, or perhaps by chaining representations of shorter distances, such as 1 meter apart. The contents of these thoughts will be fixed by source intentionality, along with whatever it takes to fix logical structure. One can then have detailed permutation-resistant spatial beliefs about the matter outside the bubble. With other perceptual contents, such as color predicates, one can fill in more details, and little of the original bubble puzzle remains. This way, there's no need for substantive rationality to avoid the bubble puzzle. So yeah, it is right. So say you have your perceptual bubble, but then how do you talk about things outside of it? Well, you build it via things inside the bubble, and then you use like logic, like Lego pieces, to build them together to get yourself, well, I have 1 meter inside my bubble, and so I can just be 1 meter and 1 meter and 1 meter as many times as I need to even get outside my bubble. So yeah, if your bubble is 100 meters, you just need a simple logical conjunction to get 101 meters from 100. Okay, so if you can do that, now the question is, do you really want to do that? Because then you have to really just make a lot of assumptions about what we're doing in logic and how powerful it is. That could be dangerous. I could see a lot of people being like, yeah, that's fine, but like, it's dangerous to just randomly apply logic in this way, because this is not a logical thing. Like, your bubble of where your perception ends is not a logical predicate. It's not a thing of formal logic. And so adding logic in this way, like, so what I'm saying here is just to appeal to certain basic concepts corresponding to certain words in the language of thought, so you could just give yourself certain like special words where you could be like, well, this is what this means in terms of the language of thought, and then I can just use it willy-nilly. Yeah, but then you have like really tied yourself to these certain basic concepts. Now, I mean, if you're Kantian and you just want to be like, these are the categories, that's cool, but like it seems a little ad hoc actually to me. That's kind of what it seems like. I guess you could do that, and it would be reasonable, because, you know, even if it wouldn't be like maybe the best metaphysics, it's sort of like a this is something people actually could do. It's like, well, I don't know what the other side of the world looks like, but I know what everything like over near me looks like, and therefore I can sort of like talk about the other side of the world, even though I'm just talking about it like it's like over here. And we can do that, though. All right, continuing. And please let me know if you have questions. I mean, I have questions, but I'm trying to figure it out. Perhaps Williams thinks it's more acceptable to have source intentionality for perception than for cognition, but it's not obvious why. It's true that Neander's teleosemantic story is presented as an account of the contents of perception, but also it seems straightforwardly applicable to perceptual contents such as spatial concepts and color concepts. On the face of it, if Neander's teleosemantic framework has the resources to assign contents to perceptual representations of redness or of distance based on their history, it should equally have the resources to assign contents to their conceptual representations involving judgments such as that is red or that is 1 meter away. If one doesn't want to appeal to conceptual source intentionality, one can instead use perceptual source intentionality, which Williams already appeals to ground the content of perceptual concepts and thereby avoid the bubble puzzle. We need only assume that 1. Perceptual representation is structured with predicate object structure and the like. For example, attributing a certain shade of red and a certain location to a perceived object. 2. Its predicative representations can attribute spatial properties and relations, such as the property of being 1 meter apart. And 3. Structured representations in perception and cognition are connected in such a way that predicative representations in thought are quasi-inferentially rationally connected to predicative representations in perception, so that the former can inherit the content from the latter. Versions of all these assumptions are widely accepted by theorists of perception and cognition. See, this is fair. This is why. People, they do assume that you can just assign things in your these concepts to like the concepts to how we see the world. So the fact that they do this means this is all okay. But this is the sort of thing that makes me worried. The idea that we're just giving our concepts specific things in our perception, or that like our ability to see things. Like, really, do our concepts really line up with our perceptions? I don't know. And the fact that we can assign them this way doesn't mean anything to me. It's like, well, that's nice. I can assign anything I want. Like, by definition, that's how you do stuff. But like, it's just you're saying they're connected in such a way that things represent other things. Okay. It's a declaration. It's ad hoc, but maybe it works. So it's cool. Things are particularly straightforward if we imagine that there is a language of perception as well as a language of thought, and that spatial predicates can be shared between both. Yeah, see, now you've got language of perception, language of thought, and now you're just matching the damn things up. Like, this one goes here, like fingers match up, It's like these things just match up. Then we can have a spatial relation, predicate S, where S of x, y has a content that x and y are 1 meter apart. S's occurrences in perception can be assigned the content 1 meter apart by the principles of source intentionality. Its occurrences in thought will be constrained to have the same content, assuming we have a general constraint that occurrences of the same word in mental language have the same content. Then we can easily make determinate claims about the world outside the bubble as above. Yeah, so as soon as you can be like, well, this is all the language in our perception, and this is the language of our thought, we can just be like, boom, matches up, and that's exactly this is how our mind works. This goes back to the old Wittgensteinian picture theory. So, now many deny that there is a common representational system for perception and for thought. I mean, yeah, and for example, Bloch. That's nice to reference somebody. But we don't need a common system. Separate but connected structured representational systems are enough. It's plausible that perceptual states can attribute properties such as red 3-1, and that cognitive states can attribute the same properties. Furthermore, there's plausibly a relation of endorsement, or taking at face value, between perceptual and cognitive states, so that a perception with content that is red 31 is endorsed, yielding a judgment with the same content. If one doesn't think that perception and thought have exactly the same sort of content, there are various weaker relations that will do the same job, such as a class of endorsement transitions from perception to thought that are guaranteed to be truth-preserving. Our interpretivism need only invoke endorsement, given a perception You know what? I may actually just send this to him because we've had more than one typo here. Yeah. Hopefully he can get it in before print. Then our interpretivism need only invoke endorsement. Given a perception, endorse it in thought as a principle of structured rationality. Then Williams will be constrained to assign contents that respect this principle. In this way, special predicates in thought can inherit content from spatial predicates in perception, and we can repeat the process above to achieve determinate contents outside the bubble. So again, you're lining up your thoughts and your perceptions in different ways, and you can do this so that you can talk about things that you don't actually see directly, but then you can be like, well, I have a concept of something farther away, and then you can be like, I can match up my perceptions with that will track beyond my the concepts of my perceptions will track beyond my actual perceptions, so as if I was perceiving things that were farther away from me than I actually can see. There is the phenomenological objection to this worldview, that this has got everything backwards. Basically, this is saying, well, we have perceptions and then our thought lines up with it. A lot of times, you can do a opposing phenomenology. You say, no, we don't actually have perceptions that we are having to line up your thoughts with. You have to have the thoughts directly, and that's the phenomenology. You don't actually get perceptions that you have to then, like a red 31, and then there is a red 31 as the concept that goes along with it. You have to just get the concept of, like, that's an apple, and then you analyze back from the red apple that it is red. But you get the concept of, like, the full concept of red apple first. And so that would actually upend this whole thing. And this would be a phenomenological, metaphysical objection to how this whole picture of reality is being, like, presented here. But again, this is a metaphysical problem, and as said before, this picture is widely sort of accepted by many people, so that's not a knockdown argument in any way, shape, or form. It's just that you can completely upend this sort of metaphysics, but that's a different, like, that's a sort of using the nuclear option here. That's not actually criticizing anything in the paper, but you can go nuclear on this stuff, and I've seen arguments to that effect before, and I actually kind of like them, so that's why I bring it up. Okay, Williams might deny that endorsing perception and thought is a principle of rationality. Certainly, it's a bit much to expect that we endorse everything we perceive, but many hold more weakly that when we do endorse a perceptual state and belief, it's rational or justified to do so. Dogmatists and other liberals about perceptual justification typically hold a thesis like this. Many other conservatives don't, for example, holding that perceptual states can't justify belief without justification for the additional premise that the perceptual state is accurate or reliable. Even a conservative might be able to find something rationally nearby, however. For example, one could appeal to a transition from the red 31 perception plus perception is reliable, or this perceptual state is reliable, to the red 31 belief. Or if there's such a thing as credence is conditional on perceptual states, one could argue that it's rational to have high credence in the red 31 belief conditional on the red 31 perception. One could also argue that imagination can be rational and that transitions from red 31 beliefs to red 31 imaginings count as rational. So if a conservative interpretivist who denies that the transition from red 31 perceptions to red 31 beliefs could still appeal to these other transitions to allow cognition to inherit content from perception. Yeah, so I mean, you can inherit, well, that's the point, is that if you see stuff, how much do you believe of it? And there's just varying degrees here. These cases also raise questions about how strongly one's interpretivism should rely on constraints of rationality. In my view, what matters in the perception-belief case, and likewise the perception-imagining case, is not so much that the transition is rational as that it's truth-preserving and is naturally regarded as content-preserving. It's highly plausible that this sort of truth and content-preserving transition provides constraints that a theory of content can exploit. If one's interpretivism can't use these constraints because it relies wholly on rationality and doesn't regard these inferences as rational, I'd say that's a strike against one's interpretivism. Perhaps one could take this as a point in favor of inferentialism, look below, which needn't rest on rationality and which can straightforwardly appeal to these transitions as content constituting. But if one is committed to interpretivism, I'd strongly recommend a form that can allow these transitions to be content constituting, whether or not they count as strictly rational. Yeah. So if you're moving from perceptual states to beliefs based on those, you need something that preserves. You need some sort of rule that preserves what you're seeing is what you're believing, in some sense, that there is something there that is guaranteeing the content in the world is similar to the content that's in your belief. Now, Williams has a long discussion of observational concepts with a complex story about how they refer to observational properties, in virtue of the naturalness of these properties rationalizing our inductive practices. This story relies largely on substantive rationality. As far as I can tell, it hardly mentions perceptual source intentionality. Williams doesn't appear to consider a more straightforward story where observational concepts inherit this content from perceptual states, whose content is a matter of source intentionality. Perhaps this is because Williams thinks that perceptual states are unstructured or non-representational, or perhaps it's because he thinks there are no rational transitions from perception to thought as above. Still, I think that current consensus strongly favors the view that perception is structured and representational, at least in humans and other existing organisms. Neander's account of perceptual content, which Williams rests his account on, assumes the same view. Perhaps there are possible creatures in which perception is unstructured, but the same goes for thought, as Williams says, and it seems just as reasonable to appeal to the contingent architecture of structured representation for perception as for thought. Given this much, and given a view that appeals to perceptual source intentionality, it makes sense to allow that observational concepts can inherit content from perceptual states in some reasonably direct way, as above. Okay, so more of the same. I'm independently somewhat dubious about the appeal to substantive rationality, in particular the rationality of induction, abduction, and morality, as an interpretive constraint of agents. At this point, I should confess that I don't really have a clear grasp on the distinction between structural and substantive rationality. But the rationality constraints I think are most relevant to content individuation are those that turn on formal relations between contents as found in deductive and means-ends rationality, and possibly in perception belief links. Perhaps more generally in constraints tied to what I call validity plus below. The rationality of induction, abduction, and rationality don't seem as tightly tied to relations among contents, and it's harder to see how they play a key role in individuating contents. Okay. I mean, it all depends on exactly what you mean by induction, abduction, and rationality here. But yeah, given the general stuff, you still have to say, look, there's some things that are just how we get perceptions, and then there's what we do with the perceptions afterwards. So that's kind of the distinction here, or at least I think it is. The difference can be brought out in imagining or interpreting specific agents. We have very little trouble imagining entirely amoral agents and even interpreting them when confronted with them. Part of what makes them easy to imagine is that they may have quite coherent relations among their beliefs and desires, even if they believe in desire in irrational ways. We have only a little more trouble imagining counter-inductive and counter-abductive agents. These agents may behave oddly in not learning from experience, but there's a straightforward behavioral profile for this. This contrasts strongly with imagining agents who are counter-deductive even for simple inferences such as modus ponens, or who are counter-instrumental for means-ends rationality. It's much harder to get a clear picture of what such an agent would be like. I take this as evidence that deduction and instrumental rationality are much more important than induction, abduction, and morality in our thinking about agents. I'm skeptical that induction, abduction, and morality play any constitutive role, though it would take more work to argue for this properly. Well, see, that's an interesting question. What can we not actually comprehend in some sense in an agent? Like, what can we not like imagine? So it's like you count the person who deduces in a very wrong way, even for simple inferences such as modus ponens, or who are counter-instrumental for means ends rationality. Means, look, they know something's better, but they never seem to choose the better outcome. So why is that, I find that odd too. I see what Chalmers is saying here. How could you actually imagine someone who doesn't do what is in their best interest? But, I mean, in some sense, best interest is always defined by what you say is in your best interest. So counter-instrumental for means ends rationality. So you say, well, this is the most rational thing to do, and then I don't do it. The question is, well, we always define means ends rationality as what is best to do. So if they don't do it, then it may not have been the means ends rationality. Maybe they have a disconnect between how they're saying things and what they're doing. But in some sense, maybe their means ends rationality, that's all it is. They are doing what is means ends rational for them, even though they say the wrong thing. And maybe we don't understand them, but that would just make them working with a radically different means ends rationality. Now, does that make sense? That even though they say the sort of thing that we think is means ends rational, but they never end up doing it, but that doesn't mean that what they say actually aligns with their rationality. That's even thin in my book, but I'm just trying to figure out exactly where this is going in some sense. I don't really understand. It's like, well, why these things are so important if they're not just question begging by saying, look, the means end rationality is always what is instrumental, but what's instrumental is what people do. So, but yeah, okay. In any case, the complaint of overkill remains. From my perspective, Williams appeals to a huge resource of perceptual source intentionality, and then hardly uses the resource at key points where you think it would be crucial, resting on substantive rationality instead. I'd say that theoretical economy strongly favors using one resource or the other, but not both, if that's possible. Perhaps it's possible to use substantive rationality alone to eliminate underdetermination problems, though I'm not sure. I'm confident that one can use source intentionality alone to eliminate these problems, either through perceptual concepts or through perception itself, perhaps given minor plausible empirical assumptions and a tweak to one's interpretism. Interpretism? I think there's a strong case for trying out these more economical metasemantic views before bringing in both resources at once. I know, that's fair. It's like, if you can do it with like one or the other, why do you have both? Usually what's going on when people do something like that is they're worried about stuff and they're trying to cover all their bases. So the question is, what were all the bases that Williams was trying to cover, and what was the real worry? Even though Chalmers clearly thinks that he can solve the problems with one of them, does that really answer the questions, the worries that Williams had? And that's why Williams did this like two-pronged approach. I don't know, but like, it's just, the question is like, what's really at stake here, and why not? And the other part is, people do overkill because, they're going to get slammed from every which way by all the other professional philosophers. So you try to like, do the best you can to defend your arguments, to defend your position. So, but I mean, that's just a sort of a sociology of publishing philosophy that you have to be super careful when you're writing academic philosophy. So it may have just been that. And then the question is, well, that's why you don't do just the one theory, because if someone knocks that one theory out, then you can appeal to the other one. I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say that what it is. It's just trying to do your academic due diligence in terms of academic philosophy, where that means you have to cover all your bases like 4 times over. All right, interpretivism versus inferentialism. The interpretivisms of Ramsey, Quine, Davidson, Dennett, and Lewis do not assume anything like a language of thought. They start with agents and their behavior and interpret from there. Williams rejects behaviorism for familiar reasons. Bloch's giant lookup table might have all of our behavior dispositions but none of our beliefs. To avoid this, we need constraints on internal states. Williams does this by assuming structured representation in a language of thought, with re-identifiable symbols occurring in many different thoughts. To interpret agents as having mental states, we interpret these symbols as having whatever content maximizes the agent's rationality in light of the constraints of source intentionality. So we've got symbols in our head. I kind of like that thought. We have symbols dancing in our head. That's what thoughts are. A language of thought is a vast resource for the interpretivist. It's nevertheless a fair resource for them to appeal to, in that proponents of rival theories, causal, teleological, and inferential, typically appeal to a language of thought grounding intentionality by grounding contents for mental symbols. But one might wonder whether this resource transforms interpretivism into something very different from what it started as. It allows interpretivism to go far beyond pinning down content by relations to actions, instead pinning them down through relations to structured thought and other mental states. Allowing this may bring interpretivism much closer to some rival views. The rival view I'll focus on is inferentialism, or concept role semantics, according to which the content of mental states and mental symbols, perhaps outside a layer of source intentionality, is grounded in their inferential role. This sort of inferentialism should be distinguished from inferential semantics, advocated by Bloch, Brandom, Harman, and others, according to which meanings and contents are inferential roles. Instead, it is inferentialist metasemantics on which meanings and contents, and in particular truth-conditional contents, are grounded in inferential roles. So, meanings and content, metasemantics. These are the inferential roles, but instead you've got meaning and contents grounded in inferential roles. So we've got a grounding step here. So that's kind of where we're going. I favor inferentialist metasemantics myself, but this isn't my only reason for focusing on the view. Williams' own view is explicitly inferentialist at many junctures. He appeals to the standard inferentialist account of the logical connectives, for example. He argues that his interpretivism, considered as a global account of intentionality that applies to all thoughts by all thinkers, supports an inferentialist account of intentionality in many local domains, such as thoughts involving the logical connectives. He justifies interpretivism in these domains by arguing that global interpretivism leads to local inferentialism, at least in these cases. Hey, another 100. Thank you. Got the wave this time. Thank you, Cinesemiotics. So, there's at the very least a strong inferentialist flavor to Williams' view. One can reasonably wonder why we shouldn't simply be inferentialist across the board. Yeah, again, this whole paper is sort of structured to say, look, you can do all the work you want with less theory. So that's kind of what's going on in this paper. It's kind of the point, it looks like, is that, look, you've got too much theory here. We can cut it down a bit and get all the same results. So, yeah. Which is interesting. The question is, how knockdown is this? Like I said, is this really covering all of Williams' worries? Because if you pare away the theory, then it feels like, well, then you're defending... You leave yourself with less defense. Maybe Chalmers is more comfortable in these theories, but Williams may not be, and there might be reasons for that. And so that's the question. Are there more worries that Williams hadn't brought up earlier? And that's the reason why Williams did not go for the pared down theory. So it just seems It's like, yeah, why didn't you do the simpler thing? It's like, well, I had this nagging worry about something. And that's kind of what I hear here. It's like, Williams be like, yes, you're right, David Chalmers. You can do all these things and get the same results. But there's a bunch of other stuff I was worried about and that I didn't get to, like, add for whatever reason. It's like, this is kind of how I feel right now. That's kind of how I feel Williams might feel. Okay, anyway, there are two different questions one can raise here. First, is Williams' view itself a form of inferentialism? Second, if it's not, is there a nearby inferentialist view that we should prefer? We can start with the first question. Williams' interpretivist view is that mental symbols have whatever content maximizes the rationality of the subject. A common form of inferentialism is that mental symbols have whatever content maximizes the validity of certain key inferences that the symbol is involved in. For example, Peacock endorses a view on which the semantic value of a concept is determined as what makes certain key inferences truth-preserving. So there's clearly a common flavor between Williams' interpretivism and traditional inferentialism. The potential differences are: 1. Williams appeals to rationality maximization, while inferentialists more often appeal to validity maximization. And 2. Williams appeals holistically to the rationality of a subject, while inferentialism appeals locally to the rationality or validity of key inferences. At this juncture, one might ask, is Williams' view a sort of holistic rationality maximizing inferentialism, somewhat different from the more familiar local validity maximizing inferentialism, but nonetheless clearly a form of inferentialism? Of course, it doesn't matter much what we call the view, but if the differences between Williams' view and standard forms of inferentialism are as small as this is worth noting. Regimenting the views like this may also make it more straightforward to assess which we should prefer. To consider the potential differences in more detail. The first is whether the account invokes rationality, often characterized in normative terms, perhaps concerning inferences the subject ought to make, or states the subject ought to be in, or validity, often characterized in semantic terms, perhaps involving truth preservation. Both interpretivism and inferentialism can, in principle, come in both rationality maximizing and validity maximizing forms. Yeah, this is where I thought we were going. Right here. The fact that you can be like, these terms, a lot of times they're interdefined, like validity maximizing, rationality, validity. All these things can be a lot of times interdefined. So it's like the question is, what is this really just a different way of looking at the problem, but from like the same sort of stance? And kind of, that was where I thought Chalmers was going to get himself to. And he did. But as I've said before, if you are reading a philosophy paper and you start thinking something, it's because the author wants you to think it. These people are very smart, and if you're starting like, oh, I think I understand this now, that's because they want you to be thinking that. We've already noted the possibility of validity maximizing interpretivism in the previous section. Rationality maximizing inferentialism may be less common than validity maximizing forms in the literature, but it's nevertheless an available form of inferentialism. For example, if the determination theory in Peacock's inferentialist analysis were tweaked to appeal to rationality rather than validity, the result would be a form of rationality maximizing inferentialism. So if the only difference between Williams and inferentialists is his appeal to rationality as opposed to validity, then while this might be an advance, it would not be much of a step away from inferentialism. Metasemantics says, well, let's not exaggerate, man. We're not magicians and we can't make people think things except maybe sometimes. No, my friend, when you're reading philosophy papers, that is basically the goal here. I mean, we're not magicians, no, but if, like, these people are very clever, and that is the entire goal of a lot of times when they're writing a philosophy paper, is to make you think something. Like, they want you to think what they think. That's the whole point of, like, this argumentation crap. It's rhetoric. They want you to see the world the way they see the world. I'll give you your 8-bit back. So, yeah. No, we're not magicians. But, I mean, when you put something up on a screen, because I know you work in film, you are putting up something to get into someone's head. Now, exactly what that is, who knows? Like what you get, like when someone's looking at a movie. But yeah, this is the questions. Like if you start to think things when reading papers, a lot of times it's because that was the intention of the author. At least when it comes to philosophy papers. Yeah, you got to be careful with these people. It's very dangerous. It just is. It's like there's once you let them get like going, it's like they get in your head and then they like start beating. Then they start like beating away at like their theory, and it's like yeah. So this is the whole point that Chalmers is getting to. All this stuff is like say, hey, look, it's not that far from inferentialism, and then it's the question is finally gets to the conclusion is it's not that far at all. The serious thing that I'm trying to get out is that sometimes we might be led to think there's something employed, and we can be disastrously wrong about what we think they mean. So I think for things like studying race, and for example, becomes very important. Well, that's true. Getting misled or reading too much into something or reading in the wrong thing, implied. Something implied. So that's absolutely true. It's very easy to misread and then you get the wrong conclusion. That said, yeah, I mean, but that's the whole point. They did a bad job if you get misled. These people a lot of times when they're purposely trying to lead you. They're not trying to mislead you. They're trying to lead you down the garden path in the direction that they want. They want you to go that way, and so they lead you that way. Now, can you be misled? Of course. Absolutely happens all the time. But this is propaganda. They're trying to lead you to a certain conclusion. I mean, you might as well just be like, straight up propaganda here. Like, this is propaganda for the inferentialism. So, yeah, we're going to screw it up sometimes, but that was on the author if we screw it up. For what it's worth, whether one is interpretivist or inferentialist in one's metasemantics, I favor something closer to validity maximization than to rationality maximization. One reason is tied to the perception and imagination involving transitions discussed in the previous section, with core transitions that may not count as rational, but certainly count as truth-preserving. Another reason... I'll get to your comments after this. Another reason that I'm skeptical as before that the sort of rationality found in induction, abduction, and morality plays any role. A third is the deeply normative character of rationality. For a naturalistic account, Williams ends up having to invoke not rationality but a non-normative account of rationality making features, something that it's not clear exists. In effect, Williams' naturalization of intentionality seems to require a naturalization of rationality, at least once intentionality is fixed. That's a huge task in itself, if it's possible at all. All right. Metasemantics says, of course, if the philosopher is masterful enough, they have anticipated and accounted for that by being clear or intentionally unclear. Yeah. So to be fair, I guess I'm just giving Chalmers the benefit of the doubt here that Chalmers was clear, like a good enough philosopher and clear enough that like I started thinking something and that's where Chalmers was going to. But yeah, there's people who are intentionally unclear for good reasons sometimes, or for reasons that they are trying to be unclear so that they're using that, and then that's just a different thing. They're trying to be unclear so that you are questioning what's going on. And that's a different strategy. Okay. Alternatively, one can invoke a non-normative notion that falls short of rationality itself. If one does this, something like validity seems by far the clearest notion. Perhaps one should expand beyond validity construed as truth-preserving to a somewhat more expansive notion of validity plus that covers non-truth valuable states, such as means, ends, reasoning involving desires and intentions, which may be valid virtue of their satisfaction conditions rather than their truth conditions. But this will still be closer to validity maximization than rationality maximization. I mean, I guess that's fair. Rationality is harder to get at. We don't quite know exactly what rationality is. Validity might be a little bit simpler, and so the idea that we're only shooting for validity maximization in terms of like how we interpret things, let's just try to maintain truth at least, than full rationality. And even if it's not just truth preservation, maybe even something that's a little bit more general than truth preservation. So like means ends involved, like so you can at least match up what people are doing to what their beliefs are. I mentioned semiotics says, you mentioned semiotics earlier, and I guess the funny thing that comes to mind is the amount of effort that goes into intentional ambiguity within the same semiotic frame. Yeah. It definitely gets more play in different areas. Like Chalmers is writing in a very analytics fashion, trying to be clear, and yeah. So you're definitely using it at different times for different effect. Alright, getting towards the end though. For a validity maximizing approach, there remains a difficult issue of which inferences one aims to maximize the validity of. It would perhaps be odd to maximize the validity even for ampliative inferences that aren't presented as truth-preserving in the first place. So it's standard to restrict the class of relevant inferences relying on a class of core, constitutive, or compelling inferences in fixing content. But then one faces the question of how to non-circularly delineate this class without presupposing the content of the states involved. There may be some benefits for a holistic rationality maximizing view that doesn't have to face this issue. Overall, I think the balance of considerations favor something closer to validity maximization, but both sorts of view are worth considering. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna like as Chalmers notes, you're gonna have what counts as being what needs to be valid is like, well, what counts as being rational, and so you're gonna get the same problem. Is not gonna go away like entirely. The second potential difference is Williams' holistic appeal to the overall rationality of the subject as opposed to the local rationality or validity of certain key inferences. To minimize the distance between the two, we can focus on a somewhat holistic rationality maximizing form of inferentialism, where the semantic value of any mental symbol is determined to be whatever content maximizes the overall rationality of all inferences involving that symbol. Now, the potential differences are 1. The rationality of a subject may involve more than the rationality of their inferences, and 2. Even if the rationality of a subject just involves rationality of inferences, it may be that maximizing the former holistically for all mental symbols at once gives different results from the maximizing the latter locally for every mental symbol. Yeah, so if you're going to do local and holistic rationality analysis, maybe it will come apart, which would be odd, but it could happen. Regarding 1, Williams says explicitly that the rationality of an agent is determined by the presence or absence of rationality-making features of their beliefs and desires. If we assume that A, all such rationality-making features were features of the way those beliefs and desires were formed based on evidence, for example, and B, all methods of belief formation count as inference, then the difference in 1 would disappear. Yeah, so if you're only adding up big rationality from little rationalities, then yeah, there's no obvious thing that would separate the two. Now, many inferentialists are happy to count all rational methods of belief formation, including formation based on perception or intuition, as inference in a broad sense, so B is not a large difference. There remains A. Perhaps there are considerations such as consistency or coherence of beliefs and desires that are essentially synchronic rather than diachronic, and are therefore not just matters of inference. Still, one could form somewhat attenuated forms of inferentialism, coherence involving inferentialism, for example, in which these matters play a role. My own form of two-tiered inferentialism gives coherence a role in assigning contents, so it's not clear that one is a huge difference between Williams' view and an inferentialist view. Regarding 2, it seems clear that locally maximizing the rationality of inferences for each mental symbol should also holistically maximize the rationality of inferences for the agent, at least if the local maximization assignment is a possible assignment for the agent as a whole. Perhaps in some cases a local maximization assignment is not a possible assignment for the agent as a whole. For example, perhaps maximizing rationality for A involving inferences requires assuming a certain interpretation for B, one different from the interpretation that maximizing rationality of B involving inferences. Inferentialists often propose apparatus to handle cases like this. My own view assigns contents locally in a certain order, for example, but this apparatus may lead to other divergences from a fully holistic approach. So there is some room for holism to make a difference. Still, it is not clear that the difference is large, and it is far from clear why, when there are differences, we should prefer the holistic approach to grounding contents to the more local inferentialist approach. Okay, so if you're going to do you're going to try to generate like a massive rationality of like a person from all the local inferences they make, yeah, maybe it'll come apart. The question is how bad? No one knows, but this is just sort of seems very academic. It's like, okay, how could you actually have a two-tiered system? But yeah, you can make it work. So it's like, well, how different is it going to be? This leads us to the second main issue above. Even if there are some differences between Williams' interpretivism and inferentialism, which should we prefer? I will contrast Williams' view with the sort of inferentialism I favor, a two-tiered version that assumes a layer of non-inferentialist source intentionality. A first tier of mental symbols have their content as a matter of source intentionality, or inherited from source intentionality, as in the previous section. A second tier have their content in virtue of an inferential connection to the symbols in the first tier and to each other, essentially maximizing the validity across all scenarios in the two-dimensional semantic framework of certain key inferences. So you've got mental symbols, the real world, and the mental symbols on top of that refer to the mental symbols. So basically, we got symbols referring to the world and then symbols referring to the other symbols that are talking about the world too. So you've got your thinking about the world, and thinking about thinking. So not too crazy. Beyond this, a comparison between the views may rest largely on how they handle various domains. We can compare the two views first for the three domains that Williams considers in most depth: the logical connectives, observational concepts, and moral concepts. Williams' treatment of logical connectives is explicitly a local inferentialist treatment. He justifies his interpretivism by arguing that given plausible assumptions, especially a localizing assumption saying that a holistically rational agent will find the relevant local inferences primitively compelling, it will yield the familiar local inferentialist results. That's a point in favor of inferentialism. It guarantees the results directly without requiring the extra assumptions. Something similar goes for moral concepts. Here, Williams' central example is moral wrongness, and the central work is done by rational transitions from judgments about moral wrongness to attitudes of blame. He articulates a thesis saying that when these judgments blame transitions are in place, the judgments involve wrongness. This looks like a local inferentialist treatment of wrongness, albeit in the inclusive sense where transitions between all sorts of mental states, not just judgments, can count as inferential. An inclusive inferentialist like me can take on board Williams' treatment of this concept wholesale. Again, the shape of this account seems to me to support inferentialism. As for observational concepts, I suspect that Williams' complex account involving inductive inference could straightforwardly be cast in inferentialist terms. In any case, I've already argued for a more straightforward view where these concepts inherit content from perception. That view suggests a form of inferentialism where perception, belief, endorsement, transitions play the central role in constituting belief content. We've seen that this picture may be slightly harder for a rationalizing, maximizing inferentialism or interpretivism to accommodate depending on the rational status of these transitions, but it's no problem for validity maximizing inferentialism. Okay, So I'd say that across these cases and the considerations above, there's a strong case for preferring an inferentialism where the content of a mental symbol is constituted by the transitions it's involved in. Perhaps Williams thinks there are other domains where inferentialism doesn't work out as well as interpretivism does, and interpretivism does better. If so, it would be interesting to see those cases laid out. As things stand, Williams doesn't really present even a sketch of a metasemantic account for all sorts of familiar concepts such as cat and in, for example. My own inferentialism grounds their content fairly straightforwardly in their inferential relations to first-tier concepts, what sort of objects one counts as a cat, for example, and which scenarios one counts as one entity being in another, as well as what can infer from these claims. Williams says at one point that he's open to a two-dimensionalist account like mine, but that doesn't want to presuppose it, so it may be that he doesn't want to rely on the scrutability assumptions that ground my variety of inferentialism here. Still, I strongly suspect that when a Williams-style treatment of cat or in is spelled out, it will look similar in flavor, if not in all details, and won't give reason to favor interpretivism over inferentialism. That said, I'd love to see the details. Okay, and so this is the end right here. Yeah, so this is basically what it is. The structure of the argument is basically paring away at the interpretivism until you get to inferentialism. Okay. Finishing up. Inferentialism and interpretivism as foundational theories. In responding to an earlier version of these comments, Williams suggested that while inferentialism may often be the correct local story for a given thinker and a given domain of discourse, interpretivism provides a more plausible foundational story that may apply to all thinkers and all domains. One reason is that inferentialism requires a language of thought while interpretivism does not. I am doubtful that there is a significant difference between the theories here. There are state-based versions of inferentialism where the content of belief is given by that belief's role in inference. For example, it has the content that maximizing validity of key inferences involving the state that the subject is disposed to make. A two-tiered inferentialism may constrain these key inferences to connect the state to first-tier states whose content is already fixed. Multi-tiered and holistic versions of state-based inferentialism are also available, so inferentialism seems to be at least on par with interpretivism in this respect. This is again, I have to just take Chalmers' word for it here. Do I take Chalmers that there are ways to do it? It's well, maybe, but this is not, this is just repeating that you can. It's not actually saying how it's done. It's also worth noting that Williams appears not to give a state-based foundational story that doesn't involve a language of thought. His central framing of a foundational story involves interpretations mapping the atomic concepts onto contents and containing rules for fixing the content of complex concepts and whole states out of the contents of their parts. He implies at some points that this framing is optional and that he could give a state-based foundational story that doesn't require a language of thought while entailing his language of thought story when one is present, but he doesn't give such a story. So it's hard to assess the generality of Williams-style interpretivism without a language of thought. I can roughly envisage how a story would go, identify certain states as beliefs and desires without identifying structured contents, and assign them those contents that maximizing rationality in light of other constraints, but it's far from obvious how this story will entail Williams' own language of thought story in cases where a language of thought is present. How is exactly a state-based story interpretivism sensitive to facts about representational structure that it doesn't presuppose as part of the grounds for interpretation? Assuming these issues can be dealt with, then inferentialism and interpretivism both seem to be available as global foundational stories for grounding intentionality. Still, almost all of the local stories that Williams tells seem to be inferentialist, and in his book, I don't see any obvious local cases that interpretivism can handle and inferentialism cannot. Perhaps Williams can spell out such a case. Certainly I'd be interested to see the strongest challenges for inferentialism here. If any such local challenges for inferentialism can be overcome, I think then we have strong evidence for inferentialism over interpretivism as a foundational theory of intentionality. Okay. So what is going on here is be like, this is like, my way's the better way. Rah, 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 rah. So again, this is based all on this one theory of Williams, and then cutting like, like cutting here, cutting here, cutting here, cutting here, until what you have, instead of having the interpretivism, you end up with inferentialism. Like it's the old Scooby-Doo. You pull off the mask, and what do we have underneath? Oh, it's old Mr. Interpretivism, old Mr. Inferentialism underneath. You tried to fool us, but calling yourself interpretivism, but you're really inferentialism. But yeah. So, which is fine. It's like people arguing for like, my way works. You should like listen to me. My way's the right way. It's better. It's more elegant. The thing that gets me is that it seems like a big argument about what's better, rationality or validity, in terms of what are we looking to maximize. Validity, even though it's a lot simpler to do in some sense, it's also farther from everyday reality. You might say, look, validity, but when you talk to like a random person, they're not going to know what you mean by validity. Like truth preservation is not going to be the first thing to their mind. Rationality, on the other hand, that does have a much more everyday flavor to it. People know what it is to be not crazy, to be rational. And so the thing is, there's probably a large draw to talking about rationality in this area, because that's what people think they're doing. They think they're being rational all the time. They're not really thinking about like truth preservation, being maximizing validity. No one thinks in those terms. And so in some sense, I'd have to say maybe the reason people like the Williams stuff is because it actually is drawing on people's more everyday concepts of what's going on in mind, as opposed to truth preservation, which of course is very, 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 very important, but it's not going to have the same sort of popular draw that rationality is. For whatever rationality is worth, of course, no one knows, but in some sense, we only have maybe a slightly better grasp on validity. But what is the cost? Once you move from rationality to validity, you've moved into some sort of technical area. And once you move into a technical area, you've lost most of the population. And so that's the issue. If you are moving into like a technical correctness with truth preservation, then you've maybe missed the point of what's going on in mind. So maybe that's basically it. But then could like the inferentialists then be like build up their validity preservation enough of this to be like, well, this is what maximal validity preservation is, just rationality. But like, it's not, you don't start with rationality, you have to start with the validity, because it's a more achievable goal. So maybe, I don't know. But that's the question. It's like, I don't know a lot of this background, but it's like, that's what it's like, all these little chips away at the interpretivism. And then you end up with inferentialism. So like all the little chips, do I know every little argument here? No, because I don't know enough of the background. But this is sort of the structure of this paper. It's you start with like one thing, but then you're like revealing it to be something else. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Nothing for now. Okay, I think I might stop for now. I'm going to try to stream a little bit more. I'm going to be very busy this week, though, like coming up. That's why I'm happy I tried to get the stream in right now, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to stream anymore till next week. But yeah. So everyone have a fantastic night, and I think that'll be it for now. Let's go see if anything exciting is going on in the rest of Twitch. Otherwise, I'll just end. We don't need to raid right now. Oh, is Aristotle live? Well, I gotta go raid Aristotle. So, we'll do that. That's assuming I can spell his name correctly. Let's see, is this the right one? Invalid username. Plato, how you doing, Plato? Yeah. What am I clicking on? I have to go copy his name. Is this the right spelling? Oh, come on. I'm terrible. Can't spell stuff. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm running away at the moment, but yeah, where is... Yeah, too many... I have too few T's in my Aristotle. That's really what it is. Yeah, well, good to hear you got out. Let's see, wait. Cancel the raid. Okay. Yeah, well, undergrad exam. Hope you did well. I mean, exams suck, but yeah, you have to get them done. So just go chill out with like some actual professors that don't give a fuck on how you're doing. We were like, they're very happy that you're there. Okay, now we can go raid. Well, yeah, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate you coming by.